When you think of Ukraine today, it's impossible not to think of this. Or this. Or this. The brutality of Russia's war on Ukraine has been shocking, but so has the rhetoric behind it, with Vladimir Putin justifying the Russian invasion as a mission to denazify Ukraine.
To this end, we will seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine.
This isn't the first time the Kremlin has used lies, labels, and propaganda to vilify and dehumanize Ukrainians. Have you ever heard of the word kulak? In the 1930s, this word became the center of a propaganda campaign used to justify the murder of some 4 million Ukrainians. It was an atrocity that would remain little known for decades, a genocide and man-made famine called the Holodomor. How could one word contribute to the death of so many?
No mass murder and no genocide has ever been committed without being preceded by some kind of demeaning or dehumanizing language.
Kulak, in Russian, means fist. It was a derogatory term used to describe a well-off peasant. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, in particular, understood the power of propaganda and how hatred could be harnessed to vilify those who opposed him. In the 1930s, Stalin was determined to deal with Ukraine, which was a focal point of opposition to Soviet rule. The word kulak was part of a campaign that would lead to the death of millions. To understand how Stalin did this, it's first important to understand why. In 1928, Joseph Stalin introduced his first 5-year plan, an economic plan designed to prepare the USSR to compete with the capitalist powers of the West. It called for rapid industrialization across the Soviet Union and the expansion of heavy industries like electricity, coal, and steel production.
The first 5-year plan was about taking a country of peasants and nomads and, by way of force, transforming it as quickly as possible into a country of workers.
At the time, the USSR was heavily agricultural and a major grain producer. So to fund his industrial initiatives and control food production, Stalin introduced a policy called collectivization. Collectivization meant small, peasant-owned farms would be taken by force and consolidated into large state-controlled ones. Stalin theorized that by collectivizing and mechanizing farms, the USSR could produce enough to feed its growing urban population and export grain to fund Soviet industrialization. But the peasant farmers weren't eager to hand over their land, livelihood, and food, none less so than Ukrainians.
Now, the problem with Ukraine for Moscow is that it's the major grain-growing area, but it also is the most opposed to collectivization. So you have literally thousands of uprisings.
With their own unique history and deep connection to the land, Ukrainians would prove to be collectivization's biggest opponents, and in the eyes of Stalin, his biggest problem. After the fall of the Russian Empire, Ukrainians had established an independent state that ultimately fell to Bolshevik forces. Vladimir Lenin, the first Soviet leader, needed to bolster support in Ukraine and introduced policies promoting Ukrainian language and culture.
The most important development at that time is that there is a school system being built in Ukraine. So you get the first generation of Ukrainians who learn how to read in Ukrainian. You see also the development of Ukrainian high culture.
In promoting Ukrainian language and culture, Lenin aimed to disarm Ukrainian opposition to Soviet rule. But Stalin believed that Lenin's policies had actually strengthened, not weakened, resistance to his regime, making Ukraine an ideological threat. It was a mistake he sought to correct. And so, in December 1929, Joseph Stalin gave a speech. In it, he announced that the time for the liquidation of the kulak class had arrived. He called for their removal through the policy of dekulakization. Vicious propaganda depicted kulaks as anti-Soviet, exploiters, parasites, opposed to collectivization. But in reality, what Stalin had done was invent an enemy. Few peasant farmers at the time could have been considered wealthy, but for Stalin's purposes, it didn't matter. He had to create a tool for removing resistance to collectivization and to Soviet rule. Anyone accused by the communist authorities as a kulak was a kulak. This put Ukrainians in a very dangerous position.
What's happening to Ukrainians in the early 1930s during the Holodomor is they are being, in some fashion, reconstituted as an enemy of the Soviet Union.
Kulak, Petlerite, traitor, anti-Soviet, anti-Bolshevik, any of these words could be used to demonize somebody and to characterize them as politically undesirable, liable to be arrested, and of course even to be murdered.
With this, a campaign for dekulakization began across the Soviet Union. But in Ukraine, another campaign was also underway.
It is also the time when the attack really on Ukrainian culture begins.
In 1930, Ukrainian leaders were labeled dangerous Petlerites, a reference to Simon Petlura, a Ukrainian revolutionary who had led forces that fought the Red Army. These Ukrainians were put on show trials, accused of anti-Soviet activities and nationalism. Ukrainian religious leaders were arrested and churches were destroyed. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian peasant farmers were also attacked, exiled, arrested, or executed as part of dekulakization. Others were coerced or harassed into joining the collective farms. And for those Ukrainians who remained in the villages, Stalin engineered a famine.
The Soviet Union already had mass hunger, and this was the moment when Stalin made a decision to make use of this moment of chaos and hunger to get rid of another problem, and that was the problem of Ukraine.
In late 1932, Stalin instructed communist authorities to take additional measures against Ukrainian peasant farmers. Collection brigades made up of Communist Party activists, urban workers, and even locals began confiscating all the grain from the Ukrainian villages. Sometimes they took all the food, including fruits, vegetables, and livestock. Products were removed from local stores, including essentials like kerosene and matches. Fines of meat and potatoes were levied on villages, farms, and individuals that could not meet the government's punishing quotas for grain deliveries to the state. In January 1933, Communist Party leaders issued a secret directive to close the borders of Ukraine. Officials were instructed to prevent people in search of food from leaving the countryside in Ukraine in the North Caucasus. Ukrainians were trapped and starving.
It was at that moment when people began eating grass, they began eating, mice, eating almost anything, tree bark, leather, anything that they could find, because there was simply no food in many Ukrainian villages.
The decision was taken in November. Food was removed in January and December. People were able to survive another month, depending, 2 months if they had more reserve. And then they started to die everywhere.
In only a few short months between January and the summer of 1933, an estimated 4 million Ukrainians died of starvation. By June 1933, people were dying at a rate of 28,000 a day, a third of them children under 10. It was a genocide that would come to be known as the Holodomor, which in Ukrainian means death by torturous hunger. Achieving this rate of mortality in such a short time required organization. But how does one person get tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people to condemn each other, sometimes their neighbors?
There have been a couple of memoirs of that time written by people, some of whom participated in the brigades, and they've written about how the words were used to stigmatize people. So instead of talking about individual people, they would speak about the peasant front or the kulak menace. And this was used to deprive the people whose food they were taking of humanity.
Through rhetoric and propaganda, Stalin had created a false reality, a type of unreality, where hard-working Ukrainian peasant farmers were demonized as kulaks, class enemies deserving extinction.
It's a space where evil is good because there's no definition of good left. The only thing which is true is the last thing that I said. And at some level, you know it's not true in any conventional sense, but you don't see a gap between truth and power.
It would become a world Ukrainians would be forced to live in for decades to come.
Stalin was very clear that you weren't allowed to talk about it in public.
At the height of the famine, the Soviet authorities refused offers of food aid from the International Red Cross. The USSR's foreign minister outright denied a famine even existed. In Ukraine, any reference to the Holodomor was deemed anti-Soviet and a punishable offense.
Denial, interestingly, is kind of built into genocide. Almost every genocide, immediately there's denial.
It would only be in the final years of the Soviet Union that the Holodomor became part of Ukraine's public discourse and collective memory. Looking at the past and the present, it's hard not to see the terrifying similarities.
Why are Ukrainians fighting so hard today? I mean, they're fighting like the dickens. And I think one of the reasons is having experienced the Holodomor. They know that the Russians, and there are many of them who on Russian TV will say, we've got to eliminate part of the Ukrainians. We're going to take them out.
Спецоперации.
Операции по демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
Well, they know that's no joke, that it happened once. And they don't want to let it happen again.